So some of you might remember a bit more than a month ago I put out a poll about what sort of content you guys want. Well, here's more stuff that's neither alternate history nor geopolitics. Although in all actuality, this has been a video people have been asking for a long time. This is a scenario about what a modern Anglo-America would look like with medieval technology. I want to make clear this is an impossible alternate dimension. What matters is that America has the same geography and demographics as today, with still being a predominantly Western country, just the technology of the year 1300. This video will be a review. I'll try to cover the basics of what America and southern Canada would look like on a cultural, political, and economic basis. If this video is successful, I'll turn it into a series, focusing on each independent region in greater detail. So, mount your steeds, raise the lion banner of Indiana, and prepare to ride to battle on the banks of the Ohio. It's practically part of this channel's brand that I read a lot. This channel needs me to read and it's my favorite leisure activity. However, you can't read all the time. It starts to hurt your eyes after a certain point, and you have other stuff to do like groceries, exercising, work, etc. This is where our sponsor Audible comes in. I listened to one of my favorite books of all time on Audible, the masterpiece Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. This is a book on an ex-Soviet commissar reminiscing about his time in the Soviet service. Everything in this book's perfect, between the writing, characterization, and historical imagery. It's even an absolutely brilliant book on philosophy. We see Rubashov's descent from a loyal party member to cynical dissenter from the perspective of the tortured conscience of a brilliant man. This book taught me and will teach you about life. This only scratches the surface of cool material on Audible. Listening to the Iliad as narrated by Derek Jacobi was awesome. Besides this, Audible has books on practically everything. If you're interested in history, geopolitics, etc., you'll find titles there on it. There's also the new Plus catalog that has much more content like podcasts and music. Click the link in the description or search audible.com/whatifalthist or text whatifalthist to 500-500. Start listening to Audible today. What will surprise a lot of people is that a European medieval feudal model just doesn't work in much of America. America has far more climactic diversity than Europe does and would thus be far more culturally diverse as well. America, as a country now, wouldn't even work with the technology of 100 years ago. Firstly, and most obviously, America wouldn't even be close to being a unified country. Medieval communications were terrible, and so a transcontinental empire like America just could never exist. Also, things like feudalism and castles were actively pushing towards disunity, which is why medieval Europe looked like this. Just as a starting point in how different an America with medieval technology would be, this is a list of the 40 largest cities in modern America. Let's see how many of these would survive with medieval technology. The first category that's easy to remove is those that don't have a strong water supply. Even in the modern world, large amounts of the American Southwest just don't make sense with how many people they have versus how much water they do. American culture, as an extension of the British culture that came from a bunch of water-clogged islands, had no concept of conserving water, and so we've seen completely insane water usage, often tapping into limited underground aquifers and pulling from water sources hundreds of miles away. In a medieval America, Los Angeles and San Diego were fishing villages for this very reason. Las Vegas, which only exists by being close to California and so Californians can party there, just doesn't exist at all. In general, the Southwest just has far less people in this world. The few people who are there are based around rivers like the Rio Grande or Columbia, with goat herders in between. The second main way to cut down on cities would be through disease and swamps. Until the 1940s, when DDT cut down on mosquitoes and we could effectively drain the swamp, Florida was an uninhabited swampland for all intents and purposes. We often forget this, but in pre-modern eras, majorities of white people who immigrated to the tropics died of disease in the first 2 years. After a couple generations, they're able to gain immunity, but still, places like Florida weren't places most people wanted to live. Much of the southern coastline would be like this with medieval technology. It even extends pretty far north. Washington, D.C. would have far less people due to being a malarial swampland. The cities north of the Philadelphia, Cincinnati, St. Louis line would have a large advantage in this regard, just as they did 100 years ago. Interestingly enough, black Americans have a genetic mutation that lets them deal with malaria, which was a big reason they were brought over as slaves in the first place. In a South that wasn't Jim Crow, black people would actually have the advantage in much of the lowland South, becoming the majority population in places like Florida and becoming powerful and influential elsewhere. If racism wasn't holding them back, black people would dominate places like Louisiana and South Carolina with medieval technology. Similarly, the opposite was also true in cold climates like New England and Canada, where black people died at horrifying rates of illnesses like typhoid and pneumonia. This would cause a whitening of states in the northern United States and Canada. I honestly have no idea what racism rates of medieval America would be, however, and so that's a big factor that we don't know. The third big factor is river patterns. Every major medieval city was built around a river system or a coast. This was since water transport was so much more cheaper than land transport. This would also make places like Atlanta or Charlotte far less important, although both of them would probably be somewhat important due to being political capitals and the Piedmont disease-wise being the healthiest area of the South. If we're looking rivers-wise, places like St. Louis should be the biggest cities in the country. However, we run into another complication here. Nomadic tribes. Medieval centralized states could never control the grasslands since the nomadic tribes had such insane advantages. Nomadic tribes were so mobile, having their entire armies on horseback, that they could ride circles around their opponents. This is how people like the Mongols were able to continually wipe out armies 5 times their size. It reminds me of how in a lot of fantasy stuff, you'll see this massive human army of like 1,000 pikemen go up against like 100 ogres, and the ogres just rip them apart. That's how it must have felt for the Chinese when their armies of 500,000 are wiped out by Genghis Khan's 100,000 horsemen. We see in places like Russia and China where the frontier stops at the forest grassland line, and beyond it lies nomadic horse tribes that routinely murder and enslave the farmer, turning the cities into piles of skulls every few centuries. Sometimes, under very strong leadership, the farmers could press into the grassland like under the Tang dynasty and the Kievan Rus, but strong central governments couldn't last forever, and whenever they didn't, the nomadic tribes would just rule the farmers back to the woodlands. Cities like St. Louis, Minneapolis, and Chicago are in great positions river-wise in geography and have amazing farmland, but since the Mississippi straddles the divide between the grassland and forest, all of these cities would be kept at smaller than otherwise possible by genociding nomadic tribes. So when we add these 4 variables together, this is a map of the 40 largest cities in medieval America versus what they are in the modern world. As a general pattern, you see the area that's now the Rust Belt has become the center of the continent. This area's got a temperate climate, fairly healthy disease-wise situation, some of the most fertile soil on Earth, and lots of water-based transport. Meanwhile, west of the Mississippi, things become a bit more sparse, with collections along the rivers and in the Pacific Northwest. West of the Mississippi, the traditional norms of Western European society don't work. We see that much of the cultures of the American East are projections of the original colonial societies created by the British, but once you get west of the 100th parallel, we see the West's cultures become their own thing. The harsh Western geography demanded changes to social order in order to survive. One culture we've already analyzed a little bit is the horse tribes of the Great Plains. We've already discussed how nomadic horse tribes already have a massive military advantage on the grassland. However, another thing to consider is that the soil was so thick in the Great Plains that it was impossible to farm it before 1880 when a new plow was developed. Beforehand, it was literally so fertile that it broke the plows. We would see a nomadic cowboy Mongol style culture develop, a culture who I want to exist honestly just to listen to their music. They lead their herds across the region and fight over grazing rights. We'd see a gradient between the fairly wet shores of the Mississippi and the drier regions out by Denver and Montana, with cattle gradually giving way to sheep. This is sort of similar to the wet to dry gradient seen in Eurasia between Ukraine and Mongolia. This gradient resulted in tribes attacking westward across the steppe towards wetter pastures. We'd see a similar situation develop here, with tribes continually pushing eastward until they slammed into Chicago or Memphis. They would economically have a couple different pillars, one of which would be that they'd be a pivotal part of the transcontinental trade between the Mississippi and California. Similarly, they'd take slaves from the Midwest and trade them down the Mississippi to New Orleans for the Caribbean market. Finally, they would trade hides, meat, and animal products in exchange for grain, being dependent like every other nomadic group on neighboring agricultural peoples. The further west you get, the more you get into goat herding country. In the regions of the west too dry for the horse tribes, you'd see people shelter around oases and lead herds into dry patches. A major failing would be America's lack of the camel, which would be an eminently useful animal in the Southwest. You'd see Bedouin-like cowboys here, living similar lives to the native Navajo sheep herders who would supplement their herds with little patches of potatoes, beans, and corn. Although there's immense climactic differences between Canada and Mexico, the terrain's barren enough that a similar lifestyle will develop across it. Like the Bedouins, Babylonians, Jews, and Berbers, they'd be able to launch some successful attacks against the neighboring settled peoples from time to time, but they wouldn't be the same menace to the civilized world that the horse tribes would be just because of their smaller populations. In the river valleys of the dry west, like the Great Salt Lake, the Rio Grande, and Columbia's, you'd see irrigation societies develop. These would be like those in Egypt, Iraq, or Pakistan. Irrigation societies share certain variables that we can see here, one of which is they tend to have authoritarian and theocratic political structures. This is since a single government controls the water and so can crush any dissenters, and that removes competition. This would especially be the case in the largely landlocked Southwest, which would stifle creativity. Similarly, spending one's entire life in humid irrigation trenches creates lots of diseases that physically weaken irrigation populations. For example, in the 1950s, somewhere around 90% of Egypt's population had some form of intestinal worm. The central government being so powerful means they don't have to create a system of social reciprocity since they can just take what they want. This results in an unpatriotic, disaffected population that doesn't fight very well. Places like Syria and Egypt were never under the control of a native regime from 500 BC to 1950 AD. Pakistan's record's only slightly better. In this world, the irrigation societies of the Southwest would largely be under the control of herder dynasties. Given how small most of the western rivers are, these would not be impressive civilizations. When you compare the tiny Rio Grande in New Mexico with a massive watered state like Ohio, the comparison really comes up short. Mormonism is a very interesting factor in the West. The Mormons were able to maintain a theocratic irrigation state in our world. I could see Mormonism spreading across the American Western irrigation societies partially since it's well suited for it, and since the degree of separation and animosity between the Mormons and the rest of the world would promote Mormon social cohesion. We could see a League of Mormon states develop in the West, creating crusades against their opponents. Being surrounded by mountains would also allow Utah to maintain stability, fight off nomadic invaders, and remain wealthy. This would be opposed by the majority Hispanic Catholic states along the Rio Grande and New Mexico and southern Texas, meanwhile, that would be facing attacks from the horse tribes of central Texas. Once we get to the West Coast, we see an entirely different civilization develop, that of the Pacific Northwest. This society is in a really advantageous position in that it is located in a wet region with great ocean transport cut off from the rest of the continent by a massive mountain range, which weakens barbarian attacks. The Pacific Northwest would be very wealthy in this world, with massive city-states like Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, and Vancouver developing. I could see Puget Sound developing either into a cockpit of competition between Seattle, Victoria, and Vancouver, or being unified by one of them into a larger empire capable of controlling the whole region. Warfare and empires here would be heavily naval-based. Similarly, I could see San Francisco with its central position, amazing harbor, and more fertile hinterland than anywhere on the West Coast, forming an empire across the whole region. It could conquer the Central Valley of California, which it opens up onto, and also has the normal weaknesses of irrigation societies that makes it relatively easy to conquer. The San Francisco merchants would control the trade with Mexico and thus would establish a series of bases on the desert coast along the way, one of which would be the fishing villages of Los Angeles and San Diego. In general, there's no way I don't see the Pacific Northwest developing into a separate civilization here. It's so far removed from the other centers of the country that it couldn't share a culture with the East. However, at the same time, I don't know what that culture would be. By the time the Pacific Northwest was settled in our timeline, we were already in a globalized era of transport, and so the coast in areas like Portland, Oregon, named after Portland, Maine, was settled by New Englanders, creating a somewhat similar culture. The Pacific Northwest is one of the few areas that was settled without having a strong established church, and secularity was the norm, which wouldn't work for the Middle Ages. Maybe some philosophic non-religion would develop here. Much of New Age philosophy isn't that dissimilar to Platonism, and it might evolve into a hippie catarist sect of Christianity that prioritized living in nature and meditation. The temperate forest climates east of the Mississippi are the areas that would be the easiest to copy Western European medieval forms. Michigan's climate's close enough to Germany's that you could have knights, castles, serfs, and market towns. You run into a sort of issue where a lot of medieval Europe gets difficult to replicate without those specific conditions, which involve stuff like the collapse of the Frankish Empire or the Norman conquest of England. But I don't want this to get too rabbit-holey. I want to make this America demonstrably part of Western civilization and similar to modern America. Similarly, I was wondering if the Mississippi Plain would develop into some large bureaucratic civilization like China's, but came to the conclusion that if America was building castles and had a feudal system of development, a big empire like that would be impossible here. In the Neo-Europe that would develop, there'd be three main trade axes, one of which would be in the Atlantic coast, another in the Great Lakes, and a final on the Ohio River. In this medieval water-based trade system, the junction points between these would all be important cities. Places like Detroit, Cairo, Buffalo, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and the like would all do well out of this system. The Great Lakes in general, being a central hub, would probably be the beating heart of the continent. An interesting thing to keep in mind would be that since nations were so difficult to maintain with medieval technology, they tended to only survive in regions with easily geographically definable borders to keep them unified. We see that the only real stable countries in the Middle Ages were on either extremity of Eurasia or on peninsulas. In this North America, we would see the West Coast develop either into a group of squabbling city-states or a mega San Franciscan empire, and the Mormons, in a practical bowl-shaped valley, would become a nation in Deseret. But most of the stable nations in the continent would be centered in the Northeast and around the Great Lakes. Michigan, Ontario, and Wisconsin are easy calls, unifying due to fighting off either each other or invaders in the nomadic steppe. In the Northeast, Pennsylvania and New York, caged in by the Atlantic and the Appalachians, would also become centralized states. Ohio is a bit more of a gamble, but has the Ohio River and Lake Erie as discernible boundaries. If pushed a little bit further east, it could seize Pittsburgh and get the Appalachians as an eastern boundary as well. Ohio, if it could unify, would be the most powerful state on the continent between a large, fertile piece of land, healthy climate, and with lots of waterways. I could see Ohio develop like France, gradually unifying into a centralized monarchy. If Ohio unified with Ontario, I think upstate New York would probably unify as well to prevent conquest. If not, it would remain a group of disparate duchies since there isn't a unifying river system. The rest of the land east of the Mississippi would largely be Central and Eastern Europe in the Middle Ages, either weak but geographically large monarchies that collapse after a couple generations into nobles running everything, or small city-states, duchies, and other noble states. On the East Coast, eastern Pennsylvania would be the most powerful state. It is the most fertile soil and the largest hinterland in the Northeast. New York was only able to surpass Philadelphia in our world due to the Erie Canal, which would not exist in this timeline. Splitting these two branches of feudalism would be the Appalachian Mountains, which I will tell you from personal experience are somewhat difficult to cross. This land is so poor and the native population have historically been such good warriors that they'd be able to keep independence in this timeline. This region would be inhabited by forest tribes like the Scots, Lithuanians, Irish, or Croats of our Middle Ages. Most of this area was settled by people of Scottish ancestry, and they'd basically revert back to that lifestyle of raiding, herding, subsistence crops, and clan chiefdoms. They would raid the neighboring kingdoms when weak and would serve as mercenaries in local armies. There'd be paths across Appalachia for trade, with merchants either hiring bodyguards or negotiating deals with local chieftains. There'd be a similar situation in the Ozarks and the forests of East Texas. The people in this area are descendants of the Appalachians and the culture is quite similar. The soil is so crappy in these pine forests that you couldn't maintain a bureaucratic society in them. These people would probably be tributaries of the militarily more powerful horse tribes to their west. They would routinely invade the lower Mississippi Valley, becoming the ruling classes of a lot of the area. On a side note, I was sort of confused as to how much to include local cultures from our timeline in this medieval America. I decided to do so half-assedly. I have the feudal regime going into regions of the South where Western European forms could be well maintained. I could make some claims like Virginia and Kentucky would be more predisposed towards disunity and amazing cavalry due to their cavalier heritage, while Pennsylvania and Ohio might be more predisposed towards trade and less on the military due to their German and Quaker heritage. However, New England is distinct enough both culturally and geographically that I still have it. New England would either be a bunch of squabbling city-states or a unified kingdom, or two in the both. In one scenario, pressure exerted by New York forces the New Englanders to unify. In another, the New Englanders voyaging from ports like Providence, Portsmouth, or Boston trade with the rest of the continent, becoming city-states while the interior is a bunch of poor farmers. New Englanders would be driven towards the sea both by their history as mariners and by their crappy rocky soil. With their high degree of social cohesion, New Englanders would become the Scandinavians or Vikings of America, raiding along the coast and trading along the whole eastern seaboard. The Canadian Maritimes would be wrapped up into this New England's naval system. Much of northern New England makes absolutely no sense with medieval civilization. Large parts of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont in this world would be inhabited by small farming tribes, intermediaries between Quebec and New England. The line between the feudal region and the Deep South is difficult to draw. The South as a cultural entity would probably still exist. A big thing to consider is the South would not be created by cash crops in this world. There would be no European market to have created something like plantation slavery that existed in our world in the American South. Don't get me wrong, the Middle Ages did have slavery and plantations, and the New Englanders would almost certainly be enslaving people from the Caribbean to sell them in the Deep South, but the Middle Ages capitalist economies weren't organized enough to have entire regions dependent on growing a single crop. You would see parts of the South growing sugar and tobacco, but in general you'd see a broad division across eastern North America between a cattle and wheat north and a hogs and corn south. This brings us to an awkward, politically incorrect question. Would the Southerners be bad fighters since people in their latitudes normally are? Peoples like the Indians, Egyptians, South Chinese, etc. consistently have lost the vast majority of military encounters with opponents to the north of them during the Middle Ages. However, modern American Southerners have proven themselves some of the best warriors in the world. This is a weird question for the American South, given it's a culture being predominantly British that's been planted in a climate completely unsuited to it. Over a couple centuries, you'd think the geography would win out over the culture, right? However, this isn't the correct way of viewing this. Those peoples mentioned before were conquered since irrigation lifestyles bring a lot of military weaknesses like lack of social cohesion and all sorts of nasty diseases. However, with the main crops of the American South being corn, that just wouldn't be the case. The native population of the American South in our timeline were skilled warriors, as was the Aztec Empire. However, the rice and sugar farming regions of the American South, like low-country South Carolina and Louisiana, would be continually conquered. We might see some of the Deep South's warlike society survive in this timeline, involving crusades into Mexico and the Caribbean. You'd see an interesting gradient develop in the South. The coastal regions, as mentioned before, would benefit black Americans and would thus gradually Africanize, with blacks becoming majorities in the nobility and prosperous farmers. Black culture would become the court culture that whites would try to imitate. Meanwhile, the Piedmont regions would remain majority white, with the white ruling class tied to further north. Places like low-country Louisiana and South Carolina, where the irrigation would weaken the native population, would likely largely have uplander, probably Appalachian, ruling dynasties, however. Areas like Florida and the Great Dismal Swamp of North Carolina, with conditions that replicate Swamp West Africa in many ways, including disease, would become majority black tribal groups. You could see the Floridians become great warriors like the native Seminole tribes were in our timeline, due to the harsh climate. Damn, medieval America's a violent place. Meanwhile, there'd be naval bases in sandy, disease-free coastal islands like the Florida Keys and the North Carolina Outer Banks for trading purposes. The last resting stop of North America for a voyage to the south would be New Orleans, the crown jewel of the continent and its largest city. Although disease would be a major issue in New Orleans, its strategic position at the mouth of the Mississippi, as well as being the nexus for trade with the Caribbean, would make it the biggest city on the continent, a veritable Constantinople in the swampland. Louisiana would either be able to use its position to dominate the Gulf Coast and lower Mississippi, or would be horrifically exploited by tribesmen from Arkansas who would rob it blind. I can't tell you. Well, that was a summary of the world in medieval America. I hope you folks enjoyed it. A strange and rich world of everything between the pirates of Boston to the goat herders of Phoenix, Arizona. Tell me if you want more videos on this topic. Before we go, I must say I owe a huge debt to Matthew White's blog, which I read 10 years ago, and he's a big reason I got into alternate history in the first place. However, as you've seen since then, it's taken on a life of its own. Before we end, I have a final announcement. I'm a keynote speaker at Intelligent Speech, a digital conference this April 24th. Listen to 24 hours of history content creator talks with 4 separate channels at once with 40 different important content creators. Tickets are on sale for $30. Use the promo code WHAT for a discount. Also, I'm starting a partnership with quiz company Takeoff where you can win real money prizes for winning quizzes on the trivia and What If Altist videos starting in 2 weeks, link in the description. Also, if you like this video, you can check out my merch in the link in the description, or visit my Patreon for the first 11 chapters of my history of the world and the first 3 of my cultural history of America, alongside cool maps and exclusive fan-only videos. Well, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.